Well, hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is helping you get more impact from your Bible study. We believe that everyone can enjoy studying the Bible with learned tools and techniques. So no matter what your educational level or your previous experience with the scriptures, join us and become better Bible students. Today, we're going to be talking about a bad view of life's circumstances. We'll be discussing some questions. Do you see time as a gift or a curse? We're going to be talking about this idea of time marches on and life can become just a same old. And we're going to be talking about, and we'll discuss that aspect in the book of Ecclesiastes. We'll be in the 3rd chapter. And by the way, if you have any questions as we go, put them in the comment section below. We'll try our best to answer them. As you see, most of our studies are a series. And so the idea is for you to subscribe, hit the little bell icon, and you'll get notifications every time we do a new video, and you won't fall behind and miss out. We'll get into this idea of a bad view of life circumstances when we come right back. Welcome back to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friend Stan Ford. Stan is over in the east and I am in the west. Never the twain shall meet. We're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to continue our series. And today we're talking about that idea of a bad view of life's circumstances and talking about that in detail as we go through the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. Now remember, Ecclesiastes, Stan, is set up so that you have two views. You have Solomon talking about a view of life from a non-believing, what the Bible calls the natural man, a non-believer.
Yeah.
Someone who does not have a relationship with Christ. And he gives that life as a counterbalance to discovering what God can do for our lives. And we're going to be looking at this today. So let's get into the scriptures, all right?
Okay.
Let's get right into chapter 3. Now, this starts out with a famous set of verses, and one of the reasons why it's so famous is because a rock and roll band called the Byrds back in the 60s recorded a song called For Everything There's a Season. And they quote this verse, except for the chorus and the very end. They quote this verse almost word for word. And so we're very familiar with this idea, but I want to look at it from what the Bible says and not just a catchy tune. So let's get into this, starting from verse 1, going down to verse 8. There are 14 cycles mentioned of this and this. So let's start by reading the first verse. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event or every season under heaven. The idea of that event is also could be translated every delight, because with the correct perspective, these cycles can be a delight. I want to talk about, Stan, one specific word in verse 1, and that is the appointed time. Now, if we read these verses, let's just look at these very quickly together. Let me read them. A time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to throw stones, and a time to gather stones together. This is not, by the way, not throwing stones at each other. This is throwing stones out of the field or gathering stones together to make fence or a building. a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart, a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, these 14 cycles are opposites of each other. There's a time for this and a time for that. And we're pretty familiar with these concepts. And we would agree that there are times in life for each of these things, right?
Yeah, that's God appointed.
All right. Now, what's interesting is in chapter 3, it starts out with these 14 cycles. That famous phrase of, if you look at the last verse of chapter 2, this too is vanity and striving after wind. In chapter 3, that phrase is not used.
Yeah.
Very interesting, because he's looking at a perspective of life, and he's saying there's a perspective that is frustrating, and there's a perspective that is a blessing, and he's going to use the term, it's a gift, not a curse.
Yeah.
So these cycles of things we're fairly familiar with, but I want to draw our attention to that first verse and the word appointed. Now, it says there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every delight or every event under heaven.
Yeah.
So it says appointed like it's an assumption. There is an appointed time, but let's talk about that word appointed in more detail. What does the fact that for everything, every season, there is an appointed time, what does that remind us of, or what questions would we ask about that first?
I think it's what he's saying there is God has appointed it. It's in God's time.
Okay, now God is not mentioned here yet.
No, he's not.
But it says there is an appointed time. So the question we could ask ourselves is, who appointed the time? And it's saying, just from looking at life, just from observing life, there is a cycle of repeat that happens. And it's an appointed cycle. It doesn't change. There's morning and there's evening. There's birth and there's death. And it's just a cycle that is appointed. Now, I looked in the dictionary for the word appointed and what it meant. Looks in Webster's dictionary, and it says that the word appointed means, there's two meanings here, chosen for a particular job. So we could say there is a time that is chosen for a particular job in life. And the second definition was officially fixed or set. Okay? So there is an officially set time for everything in life. So we go through this whole list. And then after the list, in verse 9, he asks an interesting question. And it doesn't seem related, but let's look at it together. What profit is there to the worker for that in which he toils? So you go, wait a minute. These first 8 verses are all about cycles of life.
Yeah.
These are fixed cycles. But when a cycle happens, it's the same cycle, but each time is different. Like each dawn is a different dawn. Each opportunity to keep or to throw away. It happens that there's stuff that you want to keep, and there's stuff, it's in a period of life where you need to have a garage sale and you need to get rid of stuff. So this is a cycle of repeated change. Life is constantly changing, and what's important for us in life is to have a perspective that is a healthy perspective of these changes. And it starts with this question in verse 9. What profit is there for the worker from that in which he toils? So what's the profit of working through all these cycles of life? What's the profit? And then from verse 10 to verse 15, he answers that question. He says,
Yeah.
I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He says, I look at life, and this is the life of those 14 cycles up above, and I've seen a task that God has given us in the midst of these repeating cycles. And it says, he has made everything appropriate in its time. Now, are you in the New American Standard?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Because another version might say, he has made everything beautiful in its time. And that's this idea of, with the correct perspective of what God has set up with these cycles, it can be a beautiful thing, or it can be a frustrating thing. And he says, I've observed, he's made everything beautiful in its time. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart.
Yeah.
Very interesting. What do you think it means when he says he has set eternity in their heart? Now, who is their heart? Who is the there?
That would be.
Look at verse 10.
Okay.
Remember, when you have a pronoun and you want to ask the question, who's that pronoun refer to? You back up until you get to the first place.
Yeah,
the pronoun makes sense.
Yeah, the sons of men.
Right. Now, so these are not necessarily believers. These are just, you basically could say, the human race. And then he goes, he has set eternity in the heart of the human race.
I think that my view is that he set in the heart of man that there is going to be a judgment day or a eternity.
Okay. And what he sets in the heart of every man, believer, not believer, is a phrase we hear a lot of. And that's basically the phrase of, what's the meaning of life? What am I supposed to do with life? Now, whether you're a non-Christian or whether you're a Christian, you could have this question of, what is the meaning of life? What does this all mean? What are all these? I get up in the morning, I go to bed at night, I am born, I live, I die. So what's the meaning? And that's where God has put in our hearts this desire for meaning and this desire for understanding what life is all about.
Yeah.
And he's given that to every single man. And he says, but verse 11 is one of these verses that it's a good thing to have more than one Bible. I'm going to do a video on that. But it's this idea of, when you're reading along and you come to a verse, the second half of that verse, he's put eternity in their heart so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. And you go, what is he saying? And by reading a couple of other versions, I went to the English Standard Version and I went to the New Living Translation. And I read that, and it's basically saying God has put this desire in the heart of every man to know what the purpose of life is, but God has not revealed what the plan is to them.
Yeah.
So you're left without God, you're left to wonder, what is life all about? With God, you have the faith to say, God is in control. He knows what he's doing. And that's when life begins to be less frustrating and more of a blessing and a gift. And he's going to continue on here. Read verse 12 and 13, Stan.
I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God.
So this is the idea of all men. There's nothing better for man than to go through these cycles and to just labor in his job, in his life, knowing that labor, if it's a gift from God.
Yeah.
And that gives us a completely different perspective. on what
It-
that life is.
Yeah, could it be? She's saying, don't worry about those things you can't change.
Yeah.
Just live the life that God's given you.
Live the life and live it as if it's a gift from God.
Yeah.
No matter what the cycle of life, no matter what that time of life is, live it as if it's a gift from God. And then we are not going to be mad or upset at the circumstances of life, good or bad, because we're going to understand that God has given us life to work and to go through with an understanding that the life is a gift from God. Even if we don't know what's going to happen in the future, because it says he has not revealed that.
Yeah.
But he has revealed that there is a cycle to observe. In fact, he says in verse 10, I have seen. And then in verse 12, he says, I know that there is nothing, from what I've seen, I know that there's nothing better for them, mankind, than to rejoice and do good in one's life. So you just live a good, solid life through all of the cycles. And he says, moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in his labor. I'm working. There's that labor that picks up from chapter 2. That the opportunity to work through life and provide for yourself is a gift of God. And then he goes back to, I know again, I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take away from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him, or that word fear is reverence him, revere him, worship him. Okay? Up here, it says, I know that everything God does will remain forever. In other words, God is God. And in Job chapter 42, verse 2, Job finally admits, you're God and no plan of yours can be thwarted. God will do what he will do, and what he does will remain forever.
Yeah.
Then he goes in and there's nothing to add to it, nothing to take away from it. Now, there's an interesting perspective here, Stan. How many non-Christians that you know are very busy trying to add to, they're trying to find meaning. That it might be in gathering wealth, it could be in children, it could be in anything, but they're trying to change things in their life on their own power. And I know guys like that.
Yeah.
Especially non-believers. And he says, nothing can be added to what God has planned for your life. Even non-Christians. You can't add anything that God has not planned for your life. Now, the ultimate plan of God is for you to become a believer and be blessed as a gift from God. But if you refuse to become a believer, accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, if you refuse to do that, and then go on and say, I'm going to make life in my own goals, it's saying here, no, you're not. You can't get up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to put an end to death. Everybody's going to die. You say, I'm going to put an end to dawn and an end to dusk. I'm going to do that by work. I'm going to work 24 hours a day. So I'm not going to talk about dawn and evening and night and dark and those kinds of things. I'm going to change that. No, you won't. Because every morning the sun will come up and every night the sun will go down. Your determination and your view of life isn't going to change that perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You see where he's talking now? He's talking in two things. He's talking about the natural man who has this view of these cycles are just a waste. It's just the same old. Life is just like being on a treadmill, right?
Yeah.
And there's a frustration there to a point where some guys just give up on life. I'm so frustrated, I just can't live it. But there is another perspective. Solomon has given us the perspective of the natural man, the unbelieving man, the frustrated man, and the contented man who has a relationship with God and perceives life as a gift from God. The older we get, the more important that perspective is.
It doesn't. Yeah.
And then he ends that, the answer to the question of verse 9, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Well, the profit is have a perspective of this life and my toil, my labor through life is a gift from God that God has ordained. And nothing I do is going to fight that. And all of a sudden you start to get a contentment. God knows what he's doing. God has set up these cycles for a purpose, and they're too beautiful with the right perspective. And that is the perspective of this as God. Now, we finish this up, and he says, you can't add to it, you can't take it away. God has so worked that man should revere him, should worship him. Now, a lot of men don't worship him because they're busy with a perspective of life that is not the perspective of these cycles are a gift from God. They're trying to change things on their own.
Yeah.
And it says, verse 15, that which has been already and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. That's an interesting verse because it can be confusing if you just take that verse out and you go, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
And I think he's talking back to this repeated cycle. And God has ordained a certain cycle in your life. And he has appointed that cycle in your life. And it's a cycle that has been repeated many times. Dawn in your life and night in your life is going to be a repeated thing. God knows exactly what he's going to do, and he knows exactly how many times that's going to repeat in your life. Okay?
Yep.
So this idea that God knows what's going on, and he knows that it's already happened in God's perspective. Remember, one of the characteristics of God is he's outside of time. He sees the past, the present, and the future all at once. So the things in our present that are happening have happened before, and God knows they're going to happen again, and he knows exactly what's going to happen. So this idea of God is in charge, and God seeks what has passed by. In other words, God seeks in your life the cycles of life that are a blessing if you take the perspective that they are a gift from God. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Any observations about that?
Yeah. When I was studying this, like you said at verse 1, at appointed time, that word appointed. And then he goes into these 14 different views here, and it's appointed. And I was thinking about Solomon here. He was questioning, so to speak. And then down in verse 12, so I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. And it was like, don't worry about it. You can't change it. It's appointed, and you go on. It's like death. We question why. I've heard this week about why, about a certain person who died.
Sure.
And it's appointed. We grieve about these things sometimes, and we don't understand, but we have to accept that it's appointed time. It's God's time.
And I think what you see here is that there's appointed times, and the only thing you can change in life is your perspective of the repeated cycles of life being a blessing or a curse.
Yeah.
Being a blessing or a frustration. You can change that perspective by that idea of revering God, worshiping God, fearing God, accepting Christ as your Savior and say, you're now Lord of my life. You're in charge. You change your perspective on the things that happen in your life, that God has a plan, and he'll work that plan out for your benefit. And I really like that idea of he has set eternity in the heart of man, of every man.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis wrote that there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every person. And a non-believing person tries to fill that vacuum because that question is in his mind, what's all this about? What is life for? And you try to fill it with all kinds of things, money, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Okay. But the only thing that fills that God-shaped vacuum is God. And
Yeah.
changing the perspective of God is in charge of the cycle of life. And I'm going to take life as a gift from God, not as a curse. And that answers the question. Do you see a time as a gift or a curse? I, as a Christian, and you as a Christian, we look at the time we have, and both of us time has passed for both of us. But we see life as a gift. And in a case of a friend who dies, even if they die what we think is prematurely, it's all about the perspective that God knows what he's doing and has a plan for your life and has the idea of live life as if it's a gift of God and enjoy the labor of your life. And I know the person we're thinking of that died, I think she was in her 60s, maybe.
She was 59.
She was 59.
Yeah.
This friend died, and she had a full life because she had a perspective that she lived life for the Lord to its fullest as a gift.
Yeah.
And we can rejoice when somebody like that passes on without the discouragement of somebody refusing to look at life as a gift of God and therefore dying with never fulfilling life as a gift from God. Thanks, Stan, for a good study and for your good comments. And we're going to continue, and we're going to finish up chapter 3 next week. We've been talking about this idea of time being considered a curse by some and a blessing, a gift of God by others. And listen, I have a video that you might enjoy watching that kind of talks about this journey of life. In fact, the video is about what I would call my life verse. And it talks about how you can get God's good hand of blessing on your journey through life. And that video is right here. Check it out, and we'll see you next week in the book of Ecclesiastes. God bless you.